Thanks, Alvin. Godwin briefly sent me a message saying there is an internet issue. So definitely I think he's trying to come back. So as he's going to join, let me welcome you all. Particularly on behalf of the GLI Meal Hub, we are delighted to have you join this important webinar today. My name is Mukunda Adhikari, and I work for Transform Aid International in Sydney, Australia. And I have had the privilege of serving as one of the co-chairs of the GLI Meal Hub alongside Conul for the past 2 years. I will first share a brief introduction to our Meal Hub, and then I will invite Godwin to continue. As you know, GLI Meal Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning Hub serves as a specialized platform within its Learning Hub model, bringing together stakeholders from academia, policy, and practice to co-create and share evidence on faith-based development. The hub emphasizes rigorous measurement and reflection, helping organizations improve implementation, foster accountability, and learn from diverse contexts. Let me welcome and introduce Godwin, who is facilitating a webinar today. Godwin is working as International Programs Coordinator in Transform Aid International. We work together. He is an experienced practitioner, trainer, facilitator, and storyteller with a demonstrated history of working in international development, conflict transformation, and peace building sectors. He has 21 years of experience in diverse but interrelated areas such as international development, conflict sensitivity development practice, conflict transformation and peace building, conflict sensitive humanitarian programming, and also rights and strength-based approaches to development, intersectional understanding of JC in development, humanitarian and peace building program. Mr. Idana also has 10 years qualitative research experience in Africa and Southeast Asia. He recently completed his PhD, which explored women's participation in Myanmar peace process through a Black feminist lens. Let me welcome Godwin for the webinar today to facilitate. Godwin, did you join?
Yes, he's joining just right now. He had some network issues. And as he joins, my name again is Alvin Andanje. I'm the GLI Regional Coordinator for Africa, but I also support the Global Meal Hub in terms of just trying to keep in touch and see how it's moving on. So welcome, Goodwin.
Godwin, are you back? If you are back, now platform is yours.
Yes, I'm back. Sorry, I lost my connection for a while there. Uh, don't know what is happening. Perhaps the heat. Uh-huh. Um, okay, I will just share my screen and then we can take it from there. Can the host enable participant screen sharing so I can share my screen? It's not letting me. Okay. Okay, thank you everyone. I'm not quite sure. I missed the introduction there because I dropped out briefly, but thank you for it's great to meet all of you on this platform, and thank you for the opportunity to share the little that I know with your members. I hope that I will um, be able to meet your expectations. Um, so without much ado, I mean, this is quite a very broad topic, measuring peace, what works and what doesn't in conflict-affected contexts. I thought we will start off by looking at the definition of peace, because if we don't know what we are looking at, then it becomes difficult to measure it. And so basically, and I know as practitioners in this space, you're not new to what peace is. But I think that the starting point is that peace means different things to different people. For me, peace might be having a quiet environment so I can think, or having a quiet space that I can sleep. For someone else, peace might mean having the capacity to afford to pay bills. For someone else, peace might mean having food to eat. So peace means different things to different people. And even in conflict-affected environment, that is violent conflict, often peace means different things to different groups and different individuals. For some people, peace might just be the cessation of hostilities, the silencing of the guns. For others, it might mean having safety and security, and for others, it might just mean respect from people, or the opportunity to collaborate and share. So peace is a complex concept, which often denotes, harmony. Words like harmony, freedom from violence, freedom from want, freedom from poverty, freedom from injustice. It could also mean the absence of war, as I said earlier on, and sometimes it could be a state of well-being. And we can talk about societal peace, which is a society that is free from conflict, a society that is free from social and economic injustices, a society where there is tranquility, there is harmony. We can also talk about an individual's peace. So we can be talking in that sense, then we'll be talking about tranquility, inner harmony, congruence between your values and your work could also mean peace. And peace, so in this sense, we can look at peace as a dynamic concept. Um, and as I said, for some people, it might just mean safety, not having to run from one place to another, not having to run from bullets, not being trapped in IDP camps perpetually. For others, it might be getting justice for lost family members. And so that then brings us to when we talk about peace, what do we mean? Given the different notions or different understandings of peace, then that peace can be understood in two major categories, that is positive peace and negative peace. And this is attributable to the father of peace, or the father of modern peace studies, Johann Galton, in I think the early 60s, 1964, coined these terms, positive peace and negative peace. And according to him, negative peace simply means the absence of violence, the absence of direct and physical violence. So the silencing of guns when there is ceasefire, that is negative peace. But where the underlying causes of the conflict, of the violence hasn't been addressed, where there's still presence of social injustices, where there's still resentment, there are seated hatreds amongst different groups, then his argument is that that state of affairs is negative peace. And to achieve positive peace, you would have to have negative peace plus social justice. So negative peace plus the presence of social justice. So things like inclusion, diversity, trust, uh, respect for human rights, and equal opportunities for everyone, equality in between the genders, between different groups. That is majority and minoritized groups. And I use the word minoritized instructively because often in a lot of the violent conflict contexts or conflict-affected contexts, we talk about majority minority groups. Some groups aren't usually minority, but they are minoritized from a political perspective. But we will not get into that terminology at the moment. Um, then we're talking about looking at peace or measuring peace as male practitioners. How do we measure peace? And in conflict-affected contexts, I think as part of being able to measure or assess what works and what doesn't work is looking at the nature or characteristics of conflict-affected contexts. And you would agree with me that usually these are contexts that have political instability, there is insecurity or violence still happening, there's displacement and a lot of migration to and fro. There's often division in communities. There's often a lot of INGO presence, and there's often marginalization and exclusions. And often you have corruption, you have limited services, you have economic disruptions, you have poor infrastructure, and the list goes on. So these are some of the key characteristics of conflict-affected contexts, which I believe you would all know quite well. Now, in that sense, how do we, in that context, how do we measure peace? And we can do that by mapping stakeholders and the conflict dynamics in such contexts. We can also, it's important to then look at how do we co-design indicators of peace with communities. And by communities, I'm referring to communities especially that are affected by the violence or by the conflict. It could be an immediate post-conflict environment. It's the term conflict-affected contexts is interesting because it could be a context where there's still an ongoing active conflict, as in, for example, in the case of Myanmar at the moment, or Sudan at the moment, or it could be a case where the conflict, the physical violence has ended, but there are still legacies of it, and the country or communities are grappling with those complexities. So the term conflict affected context covers this wide range of communities or situations. So it's important to look at how do we co-design indicators of peace with communities, because what is peace to one person might not necessarily be peace to another person. What is peace to one group might not necessarily be peace to another group. And what that means is finding a way to bring constructive ways to bring all the different parties together, which in itself is a complex task in itself. And of course, we need to look at triangulation of methods. So rather than using one method, that's a standard mill practice, but it becomes more important in a conflict affected context because of the complexity, the added complexities of those environments. It's important to prioritize the inclusion of minoritized groups or groups that are often on the margins of society. So you're talking about internally displaced persons. You're talking about, even if you go within internally displaced persons, there are categories of internally displaced persons. You have persons with disability within internally displaced camps. You've got children, you've got women, you've got women who are widows, you've got single-headed female-headed households. These are things that you need to prioritize and look at, including the voices of these individuals and groups that are often found on the margins of society. And then, of course, we need to analyze the trends in violence. We need to look at trust. We need to look at reconciliation efforts. We need to look at equity. And of course, again, as a standard male practice, validate and report results transparently because transparency is very important in conflict-affected contexts. Transparency generally is an important principle in male practice, but within a conflict-affected environment, that it becomes even more so important because of the existence of, there's limited trust within that environment. So what you do and what you don't do, your actions and inactions are carefully scrutinized. And so it's important to report in a transparent manner. Then, having looked at the how, I think this goes to the first question in the title, which is what works? We know what conflict-affected environments or contexts are, but what works in those contexts is when we are trying to assess or measure peace. Obviously, inclusive participatory engagements work. Methods, a triangulation of methods, so using both using both quantitative and qualitative approaches to collecting and analyzing data. It's very important. So surveys, interviews, key informants interviews, particularly pair depth interviews, especially if you're looking at communities or groups that are living on the margins. Often pair depth interviews are effective in getting people to, it's a sort of peer support for the participants. And of course, storytelling is a powerful thing in a post-conflict context because often people have lots of stories about what happened to them or what they think peace is based on their lived experiences of the conflict. Then context sensitive indicators. You need to have, of course, that again is a general male practice, but it becomes more important in a conflict affected context because of the complexities, the added complexities in those environments. We also need to be mindful of the existence of the conflict. So violence might cease, but the conflict, the underlying dynamics of the conflict will still be quite prevalent. So being mindful of that and look, how do we, using that mindfulness, being mindful, I'll go a step further to say, actually understanding the conflict dynamics, the underlying conflict dynamics, the invisible forces, the drivers. And how do we get to know that? By integrating conflict sensitivity into our meal practice. So the best way to do measure peace in a conflict affected context is to integrate conflict sensitivity. And that in itself is a whole range of activities or processes that you have to undertake. But you don't have to have a separate time for doing that. You would have, I would imagine that prior to implementing a project that is aimed toward building peace, before even you come to the point of measuring it, you would have conducted conflict sensitivity or conflict sensitive analysis as part of your efforts to understanding the context, because that will inform how you design the project itself or program and then go on to implement. And the implementation would also have to be informed by a conflict sensitive lens. And so therefore it goes without saying that the measuring or assessing peace would require you to do it in a conflict sensitive manner. Why you have to do that is because post-conflict environments or contexts are often rife with dividers and connectors. And you want to conduct your meal practice or you want to assess your peace efforts in a way that do not end up exacerbating the existing tensions, but rather strengthens local capacities for peace. And of course, iterative validation and feedback is a very important approach to being able to, because of the volatile and fluid nature of post-conflict contexts, it is important to have a very iterative validation and feedback process, which again, of course, is a general meal practice, but it becomes more important in conflict-affected contexts. Now, what doesn't work? And I think what works, I like to say, put a caveat here and say that what works and what doesn't work also depends on the particular post-conflict context. So, for example, or conflict-affected context. For example, what may work in Myanmar right now might not work in Sudan because they are two complete different contexts. What would work in Myanmar might not work in Afghanistan, even though they're both located in Asia. So the context determines what works and what doesn't work. And that's why understanding the context in conflict transformation and peace building, we often say context is chief. But having said that, generally, these are some of the things that I think that don't work in when we're trying to measure or assess peace in conflict-affected contexts. For example, the overly simplistic understanding or definition of peace. And we saw the earlier on, this is why I decided to touch on the concept of peace. Because if we just have a narrow understanding of peace as cessation of violence, physical violence, then we might end up missing measuring peace as in the absence of violence. Of course, that's important because for some groups and individuals, that is what peace is. But beyond that, how do we assess peace beyond just the absence of violence? And then, of course, context. If we don't have a good understanding of the context, if we don't understand the nuances, including cultural dynamics, political nuances, then we are going to miss the point, or we would end up doing more harm through our efforts to measure and understand peace. Then we know from a general meal practice that linear indicators really tell us much. And in a conflict-affected context, you can't really be looking at linear indicators. You need much more nuanced indicators than that. If you exclude certain voices, then you're going to create problems that will not work. And of course, we do have the unintended effects of your activities because your mere presence in that particular context can be construed by certain groups as creating problems, and that has tensions. How do you assess that? Or how do you even begin to mitigate that? And I thought that I'll touch a bit on negative peace indicators since I mentioned what negative peace is. So basically, as I said earlier on, the absence of physical violence. So you can have indicators that measures that. Number and duration of ceasefires that have been signed and implemented. Reduction in armed clashes, casualties and attacks. Decrease in displacement events where there are low arrests and detentions, where you have no reports of military operations or raids on people's homes or properties. Then from a positive point, you would probably want to be looking at trust and social cohesion, freedom from discrimination and marginalization, inclusion, justice, and equity, economic opportunity and livelihoods for people, and different groups that are equally shared across board, reconciliation and dialogue happening within communities. And I thought that in my experience, often it's very difficult to assess or measure peace in conflict-affected contexts, especially in an ongoing conflict environment. And so I thought about the relevance of this particular concept, everyday peace. And for me, I think the focus should be on how to assess everyday peace. And everyday peace simply means the everyday actions and activities that individuals and groups take to navigate the daily complexities of violence and still find ways to build social capital. So for example, right now in Myanmar, there's an active conflict going on. But there are different social groups that are finding ways to help each other. And that's everyday peace. So for me, in a conflict affected context, the best way we can measure or assess how our efforts is building peace is to prioritize everyday peace. That's my preference. So how people are holding each other together, how people, despite the violence, despite all the killings, are able to still find ways to, for example, mobilize resources and support members, community members that are stuck in that have been uprooted. And I'll give you an example. In Myanmar, in one of these ethnic states, when the coup happened in 2021, by the third month of the coup, what women realized was that both the armed groups on both sides were targeting young women for violence, conflict-related sexual violence. So what they did was they went into the jungle and built a shelter. And then as a group, they take turns in going into the bush and looking after the girls. So they kept the young girls in the bush, and the older women have divided themselves into group of six, and they'll go and spend a week. One group will go and spend a week in the bush with the girls with food, and then at the end of the week, another group will go. That is everyday peace, and that's something that we can measure because that practically sustains life, but also you can measure the social dynamics of that, like the social capital of that. So things like sharing food, collective care, inclusive celebrations, not that people will be celebrating in the midst of violence, but in an immediate post-conflict environment, people might find ways to even have dialogue across differences. Again, I'll give an example in Myanmar. Prior to the coup, the Rohingya religious minority were overwhelmingly seen by the other ethnic nationalities as outsiders. But since this coup, that perception have changed. And so the coup has actually united the ethnic nationalities and other religious groups to then realize that, oh, we are going through the same thing that these brothers and sisters went through. We did not understand in the past. So you had ethnic groups issuing statements of apology to the Rohingya. And that I thought was an act of an example of everyday peace. And that's something that we can measure uh, in that sense. Having said that, what sort of things should we be looking for in terms of indicators? We're looking at the frequency of intergroup interaction and cooperation, number of individual or informal disputes that are resolved, participation in shared community activities, instances of high level of tolerance and respectful behavior, cross-culture and interfaith attendance events, or, going to church services to pray, or uh, Muslim prayer services, an interdenominational service to pray for peace in the country. That is an act of everyday peace. Then I thought I would touch the last thing perhaps that I would like to touch on is challenges. Because conflict affected contexts are very, very challenging environments. For example, there is often high mistrust, and that will include whoever is there trying to measure peace. People will not trust you. How do you gain trust? You have the issue of government control and government wanting to interfere, political interference, where the government will want to control how you conduct that. What peace looks like for them will not be the same for the communities that are affected by the violence. How do you deal with that? There are instances where, for example, in Myanmar, because you've got different armed actors, to gain access to certain areas to collect data, you will be required to pay money. And that raises ethical issues. How do you navigate that complexity? Then, of course, security and safety of you, but also of the people that you would like to talk to, the people that you like to interview. You've got technological issues. So that then becomes a difficult thing. And of course, lack of reliable data. I think having functional data is the last thing you would expect to get in a conflict-affected context. Road infrastructure might be another reason where accessibility to certain areas might then become difficult. So then, how would you ensure that coverage of your assessment it's spread evenly across the community or country when certain areas are cut out? And of course, you've got language and culture barriers. Connected to that is the issue of cultural trust and mistrust, where different ethnic groups might not trust you based on your identity and so on. So these are some of the things that I think, and of course, risk of harm. That's a reality. Harm to you, harm to the people you are going to talk to, because everybody, everybody's safety is often the biggest concern in these environments. How do we navigate these complexities and still collect data and analyze it and present a picture that is reflective of the context we're trying to assess? But I also think that just even the whole idea of peace, measuring peace itself, is a very difficult thing because it's a complex concept. What it looks like to one person is different to the other. You can have two people living in the same household or living in the same refugee camp or internally displaced camp, but they would have different notions of peace based on their individual experiences of violence. Their individual lived experiences shapes their understanding or notion of what constitutes peace. I think with that, I would like to say thank you to all of you, and I hope that um, I have said something sensible. um, and I would hand over to the host, and then we can go into reflection, questions, and answers. I'm particularly interested to hear about your own experiences. And I do have a few experiences that I can share, particularly with regards to work in Myanmar. But over to you, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Godwin. I mean, you've done an amazing work in trying to squeeze this very wide thematic area into things we can take away from this meeting. And actually, you helped us, first of all, to just look at what is this piece that we're talking about, so that when we want to know what works and what doesn't, what does it talk about? And I thank you also for just touching on the indicators. Huh? That one was quite specific, and I was keeping close attention to that because how we develop the indicators in a conflict setup is very, very crucial, and especially for faith actors, because we are embedded in the communities and we need to be very, very aware of our contextual factors. For instance, for me, when I've been involved in a couple of evaluations. One interesting one was when we were doing some evaluation in Kenya for a project by one of our partners. And we went to the Pokot and Turkana. The two communities are normally in most of the time after independence. They've been involved in conflict for a very long time. They don't see eye to eye most of the time. But so when we went to the field there, of course, we have our tools that we are accustomed to. But then there were some interesting aspects when it comes to choosing the indicators to just measure what is working between the two communities. And some of the interesting indicators I met was the behavior of birds. How birds are behaving. You can tell if the two communities are at conflict or if something's going to happen by basically just looking at the behavior of birds and also the behavior of animals. For example, the cattle. We were told when you're in the field, if you're going to collect data with a small group of boys or morans, and then you realize the animals are suddenly standing up and I mean relieving themselves. You got to be very, very careful because at that moment there's a likely chance that you might be caught up in a conflict is going to
Yeah.
happen or a violent confrontation between the two communities. So maybe at this point, I'd just like to throw it to our hub members to maybe share their thoughts on what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And I can see Rebecca Cataldi has asked you a question on an aspect of the indicators that you had mentioned. She's saying, could you please elaborate on what you mean by linear indicators? And I also open the floor for anyone who has a question to come in and comment or just answer, or just question, ask the question that I say. The floor is yours. You can just unmute yourself. We are not so many. So if you have a question, if you need to maybe share your experience, please do so. But perhaps Godwin can respond to Rebecca's question in the chat.
I think okay, thank you so much for the question. Rebecca? Is it Rebecca?
Yeah.
Um, Thank you. So for what I mean by linear indicators are indicators that, like you have in maths, we have mathematical indicators that basically allows us to look at mathematical regression analysis, but basically to display a straight line that best fits series of data points. So but in a conflict affected context, things don't happen in a straight line. So if your indicators are looking at, oh, what happened from point A to point B, and we map that out and draw a line, you're going to miss out because normally things are happening like that. I don't know if I can illustrate, if you can see my illustration. Things go up and down, things go sideways. So it's important to think about. I guess what I'm trying to talk about is just indicators that are focused on measuring just direct, predictable ways of movement. And if you look at the concept of peace itself, it's not a straight line. It's a complex concept, but also conflict affected contexts are very complex. They don't go in a linear or a monodirectional way. Very dynamic, very fluid, very, very volatile. So having indicators that focus heavily on that. So for example, generally, most quantitative indicators are linear indicators. And in a conflict affected context, it would be good to have that, but have that in combination with qualitative indicators that allows you to look at social nuances that can't be measured on a line. I don't know if I have answered your question, but that's what I meant.
Thank you so much. And I welcome anybody else, or even Rebecca, if the response wasn't clear, perhaps maybe, yeah, she's saying she's okay. So anyone else who has a comment, a question, or just wants to share about the experience on what works and what doesn't work. Just go ahead, Mira. I can see you have admitted yourself.
Yes, thank you so much, Alvin. Thank you, Godwin, for the lovely presentation. I have a question. In the Middle East Hub, we worked on such a topic. It's about meal and faith in post-conflict context. And we tackled the role of religious leaders. In specific, in the Middle East region. What do you have to say, driving from your own presentation, about the role of religious leaders in peace, and how can they affect communities in a positive way, and how they can be true messengers of peace? So yeah,
Thank you, Miriam.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Hmm, that's that's a loaded question. I think that religious leaders, just like any other um social group in a conflict context, can be an asset. They can either, I like to use a conflict sensitive language, they can either be dividers or connectors. And in conflict sensitivity or conflict sensitive practice, we often say that there are no universal perpetual dividers and there are no universal perpetual connectors. So a connector can be turned into a divider and vice versa, depending on. So that's how I like to see religious leaders. However, as a connector, they can, particularly in religious communities, they are a very powerful actor. They are a powerful actor in the sense that often both sides of the conflict tend to listen to religious leaders. But that is if those religious leaders have earned the trust of these conflict actors over time by demonstrating impartiality as far as the issues of the conflict are concerned. So again, you would have to do conflict sensitive analysis to understand whether just the mere presence of a group of religious leaders doesn't automatically means that they are a connector. And so that, for that matter, they are true promoters of peace or local capacity for peace. So how you would know is by doing the analysis, and the analysis will tell you whether they are a connector or a divider. If they are a divider, then you would have to prioritize efforts in working with them because they have a following. So it would then be, if they are a divider, the question then is how do you use your project activities or programming activities to work with them in a way that they can become a connector? And that would require a lot of dialogue with the religious leaders and getting them to understand that they have a significant role to play either in the positive direction or the negative direction as far as the conflict is concerned. But I think the starting point will be to try and understand that particular religious group. Are they aligned with one actor? If they are, then it becomes difficult for them to play any meaningful role in terms of building peace without an active engagement with them to shift their thinking in the first place.
Thank you so much, Godwin.
That's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I welcome any other questions. I can see we are really close to the end of the meeting. We only have about 10 minutes, but please, if you have any comments, any experience you need to share. I can see Konul has raised his hand. Yes, Konul.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Alvin. Thank you, Godwin. It was really very insightful presentation. What really got my attention was this division of negative and positive peace. So I wanted to get, maybe you can give us more examples of your experience, but I wanted to know which one is, like in different contexts, you said, like we have to look into the context right before identifying what we want to measure and how we're going to measure that. But I was thinking, which one makes more sense, like practically, right? I can understand that maybe measuring negative peace is easier, if I can say that. But so when is it helpful? Is it like helpful right after the conflict ends? Because I can assume this won't make sense if conflict is still going on. This, like, the whole concept is new to me. So I was worried if you could, like, yeah, if you could share your, insights, your experiences to understand which one makes more sense and when, I know it's like the big, but it's really got my attention, and I thank you so much for the presentation. It was very, very, very eye-opening for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cole, for your question. That's a very complex question. Thank you. I think which makes sense at which point depends on what your work is on. I think context is important, but also what are you trying to achieve? So because often in measuring, deciding what we measure is determined by what we set out to do. So perhaps I should have mentioned that earlier on in my presentation too, but because that's also important, your indicators, your meal plan is based on the program or project that you're implementing. But if I have to speak to the question in more broad general terms, in an ongoing conflict environment, I think it makes more sense to direct efforts toward achieving negative peace. Because if the violence don't stop, you can't get the different sides of the conflict to start talking about reconciliation. You can't get them to start talking about celebrating the different groups' differences. So what that then means that measuring negative peace is much more important, is makes more sense and is more practically feasible because of a number of reasons. Number one, it will be hard to try to measure positive peace at that point because at that point nobody is thinking about positive peace. Number two, it will also be hard because of, practical challenges. Safety is an issue. Then number three, it's better for you to look at what people are trying to do to stop the violence because that's the priority at that point in time. But in the post-conflict environment, let's say the conflict has ceased, there's been a ceasefire, and there are efforts towards peace, and your program or efforts are geared toward building peace. So peace building. So from peacekeeping, when you're in a peacekeeping state where it's about keeping the peace and keeping the fighters separately, you should be looking to measure negative peace. But then when you move into a peace building phase, as in there is a secured ceasefire and the guns are silent and efforts are ongoing about transforming social relations and community dynamics and ensuring that infrastructure it's developed and provisions of public services and goods are being carried out, then you should be looking to measure positive peace because at that point the effort is gone beyond silencing of guns to actually then working toward long-term transformative positive transformation of the community or the context.
Thank you so much, Godwin. And I mean, I saw another hand. I think we'll take one final one. I think it was Matthew. If your concern has been already handled, that's fine. But please, you can unmute and ask your question before we close the session. That is Matthew. You are muted. Oh, Matthew is saying whatever question he had has been handled, and I can see some comments in the chat. Michael is saying, "Thank you so much for the presentation." I think closely related to the positive piece, just wanted to make sure that the group is aware of the Social Cohesion and Reconciliation Index. The SCORE index was originally developed by USAID and has since been used by UNDP in multiple countries. Perhaps members can check it out, can click on the link and get to familiarize with this tool. Also, he's saying I used to be a grant manager for USAID in Northern Ireland. That was partially implemented by faith-based organizations, and he's happy to share more examples that are related to the program. So I think we really pressed with time, but I don't know if Michael wants to speak to this before we just wrap it up. Okay. Make some small announcement, then we wrap it up. Michael, if you would wish to vocalize your
Sure.
input.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Godwin. I agree that it's difficult to measure peace, and it's hard to find good resources in that effort. And that was really my intention with the comments I put in the chat. Since the closure of USAID, there's a lot of resources that have gone offline or are more difficult to find than they were historically. I worked at USAID up until 2016, so I have some of that historical references that could potentially be helpful for the group, including with some peace building programs. Cyprus, there was also a peace building program. So happy to try and connect people with those resources if possible.
And we highly welcome that. Thank you so much, Michael. So I think we have really come to the end of our session. It was a 1-hour session, and it's very short. But you all understand that this is a result of the survey we did back in April, in March, April this year, and we were just trying to map out what topics, what thematic areas our members could be most interested in. And we are really lucky that Godwin, with all his experience, was available to share on this topic area. So thank you so much, Godwin. But we also invite other members who might have experience in different fields, not just peace, maybe even another thematic area. We will be planning another webinar where you can share, and hopefully sometime maybe next year we can be able to raise funds for an in-person event for us just to reflect, to exchange knowledge, God willing, that is. So thank you so much. Maybe just another. Okay, yes, Mira.
I want to thank everyone, and just before we wrap up, if possible, if we can turn on our cameras to take a quick family pictures, a picture, if that's okay with everyone.
Oh, okay. Just before we take the photo, then there was another question in my a direct question to me about how someone can join this hub. So we are also in the process of receiving new members. So if you have a partner organization that would be interested in the work that the hub is doing, please feel free to share the information to my email, the JLI email that you received the invite through. Then we can have another bigger meeting where we do a round of introductions to the hub and what we do and all that, so that we can keep the hub active and engaged. So feel free. And we'll be sharing this presentation with you after this. So no worries if you were dropping in and out. Thank you so much.
I want to add that Dr. Jacinta said that she's interested in joining the hub. So we will be sharing with you the recording and the minutes of the meeting. And also you can join the newsletter of JLI, so you can keep an eye on our news and events and any other related webinar that we will be holding. So we will be surely in touch with you also. So let me take a quick picture. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. Oh, let me look.
Should we smile or should we look peaceful?
Whatever you want.
Thank you so much for
everyone.
making time for this, and have a wonderful evening, morning, and rest of your day.
Thank you.